Hello, hello, hello. So, good afternoon, or good morning for those of you who are on the other side of the world. We're opening up the webinar. It's going to take a couple of minutes for people to come in. We had, I think, nearly 40 people register. I expect that most of those won't turn up. I even see that somebody has sent their AI note taker into the meeting because it wouldn't be AI hype if we didn't have AI physically in the meeting to commune with us. So while people are getting ready, what I want to do is quickly just summarize what this webinar is about, just in case you come into the wrong webinar, maybe you're here for a webinar on cheese or something. And then I'm going to introduce our speakers first, Oliver, and then Brian. I'm Duncan Chapple, by the way. I'm hosting today's webinar, and today we're going to be posing the question: is artificial intelligence the most hyped technology ever? Yes, so obviously from ChatGPT last year now to huge changes in enterprise AI platforms to what governments are doing. Organizations all around the world are struggling with huge expectations and super complex realities. And I'm delighted to have two people who are real industry insiders who'll be able to help us navigate our way through the conversation. But first, I want to introduce Oliver and then Brian. And I'm starting with Oliver in a way because a presentation that he made at a Institute for Influencer and Analyst Relations event in London last year really was the spark of this conversation. He showed an AI hype cycle to the delegates at that meeting, which got huge engagement and really showed in a way that a lot of the dynamics in hype for AI are maybe very familiar to people on the vendor side introducing technologies broadly. And Oliver is somebody with extensive experience in private equity and in technology. He's a senior advisor at Elysian, which is a private equity-based digital consulting firm that helps organizations to scale, and also one of the operating partners at Talamon, which is a co-investment platform that partners with top-tier PE funds. So somebody who's really kind of up to his elbows in the muck of the markets, but also somebody who has amazing experience at Gartner, where he grew the PE and VC team there to become one of its best performing, most impactful teams. And then Brian, similarly, another recoverer from a similar scene, really thriving at the intersection of technology and strategy and innovation, is somebody who's gone through a whole series of strategy roles, pushing organizations through growth, leading M&A, and again had several years in Gartner's research and advisory services, working with some of the most impactful AI and digital transformation settings. So Brian, Oliver, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to have an amazing conversation today.
Pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks so much for the intro.
I want to start off today just by kind of framing what we're doing, because it was that picture of the hype cycle, Oliver, adapted for AI, that brought this conversation into shape. And immediately, because the hype cycle is a diagram from Gartner where both of you were leaders, immediately that templating of hype compares AI hype to other hype. And I want to start off like, I think that I wonder whether that is a good comparison, actually. Is this roller coaster like picture a useful model for thinking about AI? Is it something very different. And I wonder actually, Brian and Oliver, I think this is something you can both come in on. I mean, Brian, I remember you've got this lovely analogy of a roller coaster, and Oliver, I know
Yeah,
you've got lots to
yeah,
say about many things. But Brian, actually, do you want to start us off? I think this roller coaster analogy
sure.
is something I found telling to lots of people since we've spoken about it.
I think we even had pictures at the time
Indeed, indeed.
that really tells the story like a roller coaster. And the thing with the roller coaster is you always need momentum sort of to clear the trough. So if you look at the AI adoption that follows that hype cycle, in my opinion, you have the exciting breakthroughs that create that massive interest. Think of ChatGPT in the late 22. That was the innovation trigger for a lot of organizations. And then what often happens is there is overhyped optimism and really unrealistic promises. Things like AI will replace all of the jobs. So it's really a peak of inflated expectations. Um, and then reality hits, and all of a sudden, tech limitations are becoming clear, and we see interest drop. Think about before the Corona pandemic, when we really had, the early chatbot failures that were out there, and the racism chatbots that came to bear. And then what really starts to happen there is that you get to that slope of enlightenment, or the plateau of productivity, where gradually, practical adoption starts to stabilize. And the more shallow you can make that trough, the easier we are getting into the reality of what this time AI can bring. So if I think about success in AI over the next couple of years, then it really requires some sustained innovation and real world application to really push it through that trough, where then early when early enthusiasm of organizations starting to fade slowly. And we need to get that enthusiasm up again.
Yeah, no, and I definitely agree with that. With that statement of AI is probably the most hyped, let's say, technology area ever. I mean, I would definitely agree with that. There's so much promise because I think at its core, it essentially says that we're creating digital intelligence that at some point can become autonomous and start making decisions, which is the whole, let's say the next buzzword or what have you is agentic. Now everybody's talking about agents within the enterprise because generative AI is very cool when it came out with the Chat GPT moment. I think Coca-Cola and Bain and Company had their first fully Gen AI created marketing campaign at the beginning, and now more and more use cases are bubbling up within enterprises. But there are a lot of ethical, responsible AI types of questions that they have to answer, and they need to create a strategy around it, which is, I think, a lot more complex than let's say the other super cycles, like for example internet or mobile, where you have a similar level of hype. You have the dot-com bust, everybody comes back to reality and thinks it's not going to become a kind of general purpose technology and everybody's going to get access to it, et cetera, et cetera. But for companies and organizations across the board to really get value out of it is, I think, we're at that point right now. And I'm having tons of conversations with CIOs and CTOs at large companies, and they're all struggling with a couple of areas within AI, which is how do we apply it to our organization? How do we make domain specific type of use cases where it's going to really add value? And I think the ultimate benefit that it's going to show is how are we going to get productivity gains that gets translated into economic growth, right? Because if you could say the developed world's been growing 2%, adjusted for inflation is like zero. So when are we going to get these massive productivity gains? And I remember when I was still at Gartner and RPA was the fastest growing subsector within enterprise software, and there was so much hype around, we're addressing the total addressable market for RPA is labor, and labor is a multi-trillion-dollar market. So how are we going to start replacing that? And then I think that also went through a certain cycle where companies bought into the idea and the concept, but then the reality was very, very different, and the bots broke and they weren't as intelligent or had very little AI or intelligence baked into them. And then they have to kind of adjust it to their complex, highly siloed, very poor data, very poor process environment. And, I think that's where we're currently at. So I think the promise is huge because of the potential transformation of creating, super intelligence. It's just, who are going to be the companies that are willing to take those first big bets. And, I think a lot of that innovation essentially occurs, in the US because, especially from an investment perspective, they have more of an appetite to kind of dream big, to make huge bets on very low probability kind of black swan outcomes. And that's just the pure nature. And I think investors realize that if you look at like the internet and mobile super cycles, you're going to have a couple of winners that kind of come out of that and create a couple of trillion in market cap. It's just, you have to bet on a lot of different horses to get one of those winners, or to get a certain level of return if you're an investor. Whereas in Europe, it's a lot more cautious. The funds tend to invest, when there's already product market fit. They don't do massive seed rounds. But I think that is changing to a certain degree. There's a lot of engineering talent. There's a lot of appetite from especially U.S. investors that have come to Europe that are investing in these European tech companies. But yeah, I think we're definitely at a point now where large companies and organizations are saying, okay, how are we going to really create substantial value off the back of these new developments and start to leverage it in the best possible light.
Right, Brian, I wonder, can I invite you just to think about that transatlantic difference and then come back to your metaphor of the roller coaster, right? I think in North America people often make bigger bets. So does this mean like you need more fools to get the roller coaster going in North America? It's going higher up. Like, are we talking about US the AI hype is like Thunder Mountain or something like that? But what we're looking at in Europe is something more like the fun fair at the annual church party, something like that.
Well, if you think about it that way, then it's very simple. Silicon Valley moves fast, embraces high risk innovation, like Oliver is saying, prioritizes basically scale over regulation. Look at OpenAI, look at DeepMind, look at Anthropic, look at all the companies that are making applications nowadays to get the hype going. And then if you look onto the European side, it's more cautious, it's regulation driven, it's focused on the ethical side of AI. With our GDPR or the EU AI Act that is in there. And then at the end, the result of all of that is that we have fewer AI unicorns, due to the more risk-averse investment culture that Oliver was talking about. So you can understand that pushing from the US more up to the top of the hype, where we also need to go down on the roller coaster into that trough. Europe is more of behind it and will get much more into the productivity stage, and more not an early adopter with a lot of tech enthusiasts and startups and forward-thinking enterprises. But we will see that more mainstream customers that expect more polished and reliable and regulation compliant AI solutions in Europe will actually start embarking upon that. That's just a fact as we are seeing it today in the marketplace. And Europe really needs to think about how can we also increase that innovation, basically because we're slowing down, because we're risk averse. And I think just a couple of days ago, the EU leaders, put a big fund up in order to get the investments to increase also our innovation and our AI projects that are out there. So hopefully we will follow a little bit more that fast-moving, high-risk innovation that we're seeing in the Silicon Valley areas and nowadays. That's a hope, but I'm not sure whether or not we will succeed in it, to be honest.
And it makes me think about like both the appetite of investors and the appetite of end users. Like I think it's a bit of a cliche that if you're so for example, I'm working with a Finnish software company that sells solutions that help improve operational intelligence in manufacturing sites. Yeah.
Yep.
And when they're selling into North America, the buyers in North America are much more interested in understanding how they can grow their business. And in Europe, they're much more interested in saving money or in efficiency gains. Yeah. So the whole, I don't want to generalize to the whole world, right? But then obviously that must mean something to investors, because a company that's helping its customers to grow is pushing against an open door, whereas a company that's helping clients to become smaller in a way, that's not such an exciting opportunity for investors, perhaps.
Yeah, no,
What
I think.
Go ahead, Olivier.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely the case. In the U.S., it's I think there's a couple of other factors. It's the largest enterprise software market for a reason. It's a homogenous market. There's a lot of mid-sized companies that are willing to experiment with technology, which you don't really have in Europe. Europe is extremely fragmented, politically, languages. So there's all these different types of barriers, and especially languages within AI is of course, a critical piece. The dominance that's going to emerge at some point is going to be trained on a certain data set, which is primarily English. So yeah, how do these types of countries like France and Germany still maintain their kind of cultural heritage when they're looking for their homegrown AI? And Mistral is probably the outlier, or another French company, Hugging Face. So there are some kind of bright spots out there, and there is some innovation going on. And a lot of the people that are setting up these companies are ex DeepMind or Meta, or have worked in some of these leading companies and have gone back to their home country and said, well, we're going to start to build something for ourselves. And that's kind of what Mistral did. And then you have certain entrepreneurs like the Bernard Arnaults of this world that are willing to put hundreds of millions into these types of companies, which he's done as well. So I think there's definite appetite to invest. I think just the kind of environment to set up businesses and the legislation around stock options and really motivating European companies not only to found businesses in Europe, but also to headquarter them, and then ultimately there has to be liquidity in the public markets, which I don't really see happening. I mean, I guess another outlier there is Adyen, a big payments provider in the Netherlands, or Darktrace, but Darktrace was taken private again by a U.S. investor recently. So you need to create this whole type of ecosystem, from the kind of talent university to the seed venture capital investors, all the way to the public markets. And if you don't have that level of appetite for taking risk, it's very, very difficult to compete. And if you look at the most successful enterprise software company in Europe, with being SAP, I really respect SAP, don't get me wrong, but if you look at the other kind of juggernauts in the US, like Microsoft or Oracle or Salesforce, it's totally at a different scale. And I think a lot of that is around that entire ecosystem in Silicon Valley, and now different tech hubs in the US, where a lot of the entrepreneurs that have been successful in the past are also helping the future entrepreneurs, and that's why they're being able to attract, and they all flock, whether it's Indian CEOs or people that want to go start their companies. They all flock to the US because they have this environment where they can thrive and be extremely successful. China has that to a certain degree. They have some huge companies like Baidu and Tencent, Alibaba, etc. And the whole DeepSeek thing kind of threw the whole AI race wide open. But yeah, you need to have a seat at the table, and you need to have certain table stakes, which is saying, hey, how do we create this environment where these companies can really, be successful, and we don't look down on success, which sometimes tends to be the kind of philosophy of looking at successful, people that are financially successful or have set up companies. They get obviously get taxed, and I think Europe has a very different type of way of looking at this. So yeah, and I think I think at the end of the day, it's very difficult to change who you are. Even though you had the AI summit a couple weeks ago in Paris, where there was big announcements that were made, and there's definite appetite, and now the Middle East, and that's another area that we haven't really spoken about. They want to kind of take on the role which Europe had for a long time, and they're investing heavily in AI as well. And they, of course, they have a lot of petrodollars, and they can do this. But that's another kind of hub where, especially in the Kingdom and the UAE, they see that as a key area for their long-term success. So I think all these factors definitely kind of contribute to investing. And investing isn't investing in hype, and you need to have that kind of again appetite to kind of get it wrong. And I think failing in Europe is essentially you're not allowed to fail, and then it's it's disgrace, it's shame, etc. Whereas in the US and other parts of the world, it's you have to fail quickly, especially learn from that and then try something new.
Yeah, the hype helps you, when it attracts funding and attracts talent, it attracts public attention, in this case to AI development, and it drives experimentation and fast adoption, tracks that are out there. And it also forces your competitors to really, innovate faster. Think about, Google rushing BART after OpenAI's breakthrough that were out there. And then you also need to understand that hype then sometimes also hurts when it over promises and it leads to some sort of dissolution. I think that we're going to have self-driving cars already in 2020 or maybe even earlier. That never happens. Gonna go there, but hype hurts in that respect, and so we have a little bit of dissolution there. And it also fuels regularity panic. Basically slowing down legitimate AI innovation that is out there. So there's always two sides of the coin. Always, when it comes to hype, it helps, it pushes things forward, but then it also sometimes it hurts. And then if you look into the US and versus Europe and other sides of the world, then Europe, I think, looks a little bit more into the pain instead of that it actually helps to get us further.
And then just thinking about that transatlantic difference, I mean, I've often thought one of the things that makes me sad is that very often I see this dialogue especially in North America, to say that there is no innovation in Europe, but very often what happens is that firstly innovative ideas they get bought by North American organizations that have more access to capital and can better fund European organizations through to the next stage. But the other is that very often a European technology can do more under North American ownership because of the different risk profile of the buyers as well as of the investors, of that interest in transformation rather than just productivity gains.
Yeah. So my we also can look from a European perspective also in a very positive way, because my experience so far is with European companies using AI, as soon as they start to embrace it, they're going to go all in. As soon as regulation and stuff is in place, great companies come out of it, whether it is usage or also from the vendor side. Look into a company like Cognigy in Germany. If there's one successful AI chatbot company that is out there, then it's a company like Cognigy, very successfully ahead of many of the US companies that is out there today. So we very much also have success stories, and where there might be fragmented use in the US, or in other parts of the world. And as soon as we have stuff in place, we may not be the early adopters, but if we get a little bit more mainstream, I see European companies very much embracing a technology, and in this case, then probably the AI side of things.
Yeah, no,
And
no, and I think on that note, I mean, there's another one in Germany that's in the same space as Cognigy called Parloa, which is backed by Altimeter, which is a big, U.S. Very successful fund that's invested in other AI companies like Glean, et cetera. And that's a good example. And I was also at a conversational AI company called Unifor, is taking a part of the enterprise, which is customer service and contact center agents, and saying, okay, we're going to look at what part of that entire experience can we start to streamline, and all of the manual repetitive tasks that these contact center agents are doing, how do we minimize all of those tasks as much as possible, and make sure that the end customer is getting the best possible experience possible. So I think that's a good application of AI, and customer service seems to be one of the first areas to start with, because one thing that end users hate are sitting on the line, if it's with your airline or with your, telco or what have you, and having to wait for an hour and a half, and just getting really, really frustrated. And a lot of those queries can be answered through technology. So it's enhanced more than anything. But, I think in the future, the holy grail of this type of technology is that you're not even going to realize that you're speaking to an AI, that it sounds so conversational, and that it's all in natural language, and they understand everything, and they can solve your problems as quickly as possible. And especially the younger generation, the Gen Z, they don't really care as long as their problem is solved. So, I think we're definitely moving towards that way of interacting with different technologies. And, it just, I guess it goes back to the old saying of, you underestimate the long term, and you overestimate the short term. And there's hype. And if you look at the kind of, the Webster's definition of hype, one is publicity and the other one is deception. So it's like you're publicly, or you're publicizing, a potential where people think, oh yeah, and I think it's also a European, or particularly it's a very British thing, to be cynical about things, right? To kind of ask, oh, is that really the case? And being critical is also part of the culture. So that could also be one of the underlying reasons why investors have to be cynical in a way, whereas in the US I think they're a lot more open, and they're saying, well, I'm willing to take a punt. And I realize at the end of the day, if you look at the numbers, I'm going to, let's say of the 15,000 companies that get investment every year, probably 5,000 of those are from tier one VCs, and then 25 of those return 90% of their funds. So if you have that kind of calculation and data in your head, you have to, I think you have to be very open to being like, okay, I'm going to make these investments, and I'm just going to write them off to a certain degree. And there's very few investors that have essentially built these large companies and known what kind of blood, sweat, and tears goes into them, and can sit in the CEOs and the entrepreneurs' shoes and in their seats and give them real advice. I think a lot of some of these VC firms have, MBAs, or, done a couple of years in investment banking, and then they sit on the board, and then they're just talking about very basic things like, oh, how do you ship your product faster? How do you reduce costs? And, I think the kind of greatest investors that, let's call it the tier ones, they have the ability to really help these companies turn into large companies, and know what type of people, what type of processes, what type of investment is needed through their different phases of growth. And you just have a lot less of those companies in Europe versus the US. So then you just don't, the pool of talent that you have to advise, and the kind of VCs and operators and the advisors that you take on board, I think that pool is a lot smaller. But I think in Europe in particular now is a great initiative called Boardwave, which was set up by Phil Robinson, where he's trying to create a similar type of ecosystem for entrepreneurs, investors, investment banks, all of the, different services companies around that kind of make it work, and to create something similar, which is helping, the early stage companies be more successful, and saying, okay, I stood in your shoes if I'm a later stage CEO, or if I'm an investor, and I can help you from A to B. and whether that's doing introductions or helping them structure their operations, et cetera, is going to be critical in their success moving forward.
Can I bring you both to this point about kind of capital requirements? Because I was thinking there's a question in the chat from Neil who asks whether Gartner has tamed hype, and I can see that if you think of the hype cycle, drawing the hype cycle, it makes it available as a framework for people to use when they're reasoning about things. But in a way, like the less tame your hype is, the wilder your claims, maybe the easier it is for you to get more money. So maybe your capital requirements depend a little bit on your hype. You think of that customer service example you were giving, Oliver. I mean, that sounds like something that's super straightforward. A buyer can understand it. As an investor, I'm going to think, well, how much money is that going to, how much investment is that really going to need before I can see a proof of concept that's going to, generate some cash flow for me? Maybe I don't need too much hype in that situation. Whereas if I've got something that is maybe a little bit less, maybe it looks bigger, right? But maybe it's a dream that's, maybe it's a piece of steak that's bigger than my stomach, right? Maybe then I need more hype. I mean, is that how it works?
Well, at least just the experience that I have with it, then I think that Neil is right. On his question that it is tamed. I wouldn't use the word tamed, but I would use the word guidance in that respect, because that's I see how many of them are actually using it. The customer service example. So basically, a category that I created at the time, which I called virtual customer assistant, which was basically a chatbot in customer service that would help with solving questions, was very much on the forefront of all of the AI initiatives that were out there. So if you look at the hype cycle, that already sort of gets to a plateau of productivity. Whereas at the time already, we saw that ChatGPT or LLMs were still at the beginning of that hype cycle. So we see more and more organizations and investments, and that's how Oliver and I worked together. We could help the investment community here to educate them of what was out there to come and what kind of companies to look for to actually start investing in again, and on what type of companies they were actually already pretty late again if they were thinking about just the customer service example that was out there. So taming. I would replace that with guiding, and then the guiding is the good word there to help people process what they should be looking for in investments, but also big companies. I work with big banks in the US that did a lot of, they had their innovation budget, and they would spend their innovation budget based on some of the hype cycles they saw out there for their specific industry or for a specific technology, where they then would experiment over the next couple of years. So that they had what Gartner at the time called having mode 1, which is keeping the lights on, and where I can have a lot of experimentation with mode 2, which is doing all sorts of innovations, fail, do something else again, and make sure that in the end, out of the 10 or 50 or 60 innovations that I did, there's a few of them that actually bring me real benefits in terms of revenue or cost or customer experience or whatever it was at that particular point in time. So, bottom line, guiding is the better word, I think, for different groups, whether you are a vendor, software vendor, whether you are an end user, or whether you are an investor.
Yeah, and I think that, the hype cycles have been around for kind of decades, and it was initially set up so that enterprise buyers could discern what is real and what is just marketing hype. And I think what Gartner and other analyst firms try to do is to get real world examples and case studies from the different, up and coming technology vendors to really gauge, what value is that really bringing to the organization. I think that's exactly now what's happening with AI is trying to get those use cases publicized in some way that other companies could then say, okay, we're not going to be the tech enthusiasts, the early adopters of this technology, and you have certain companies that like to prime themselves as such, which is fine. You need those type of innovators. And funnily enough, even the kind of European, big industrial companies that are very successful, like the Airbuses and Mercedes-Benz and Schneider Electrics of this world, their innovation teams, typically sit in the US in the innovation, in Silicon Valley or what have you. So that shows you again where the innovation comes from, and then where they then choose to adopt it within their enterprise, which, obviously is still headquartered here in Europe. But, I would say that, yeah, there's, from an end user and from a buyer's perspective, you want to spend that innovation budget in the best possible way, but then ultimately look for real transformational use cases. And I think now with AI, it's heavily focused on productivity. And that's just purely because people are testing it out on things and on data that is not very sensitive, isn't core to their kind of operations, because there's still a lot of concerns around data security, data privacy, data leakage, if you're putting all of your most valuable workloads and data into OpenAI or Anthropic's models, and they're using that as training data, even though they're giving you all of the kind of legal, ramifications that they're not going to do so. So, yeah, I think it's I think it's an interesting point, and I think AI is probably developing a lot faster than anything else, any other technology that I've seen in my lifetime. And it's just, how do you pick, the companies that are going to be the most successful? And I think it's part of it is the funding element, especially if you're a frontier lab like OpenAI, or on the open source side, like Llama. They're investing heavily in their models to make them, more efficient. And I think at the end of the day, companies are also going to look at, the cost of everything. So they're just like, they initially get really excited through the hype around the potential, but then they also have to look at, what is it going to cost and what is going to be the potential benefit, and making that calculation in a real type of, live use case environment is where we're currently at. And that kind of transforms itself into something that the enterprise understands, which is, agentic or agents, saying, I want an agent for customer service, I want an agent for HR, and I want to give them at some point autonomous decision making. And then as they get more efficient and you put certain guardrails on that they can, and you have confidence that they're going to take the right decisions, then you start to up the game, and then you'll probably see a lot more productivity gains. But, similar to RPA, where you're saving 10,000, 20,000 hours, I think a lot of companies were expecting to, for that to hit the bottom line or hit the productivity, and that hasn't really happened. So there is a certain level of cynicism on top of the already, kind of cynical culture to looking at these new technologies. And, I think at the end of the day, nobody wants to be the first. So being the first and, making all of those mistakes is, I guess, yeah, especially in the European context, people just don't want to do that.
You need to take also, sorry, Duncan, I think there's one thing always to take into consideration. End users who want to use your technology, are normally going to do it in a completely different way that vendors are envisioning it when they are at their drawing boards. And that is part of that trough that is out there. They start many times with their proof of concepts. They have some early success with it, but then they need to scale it out also, and think about where the benefit really has to come from. And then all of a sudden we are getting into a situation where you run into data limitations, where you have integration and operational complexity that doesn't help you to get out of the garage and roll it out and scale it out in that respect. And then you come to what Oliver just said, also the cost and the ROI challenges that are out there. Running an AI POC is simple and cheap, But really getting it to production all of a sudden becomes expensive. I need API costs, I need cloud infra, I need GPUs, I need compliance, etc., etc. And then I need to justify that ROI. That's where the problems nowadays are starting to come in for a lot of organizations. So they're really looking for those use cases, and get through those three main barriers that I just mentioned: data limitations, integrations, and cost challenges. Something that Oliver also just picked up.
And can I ask what this means about like build versus buy decisions, for example? This idea of the hype cycle as something that is guiding investors and enterprises, I think is really useful if you think about, for example, advising a CIO about how much risk, how much hype can they be building into their portfolio of IT projects that they're engaging on. But also, I think it's a very appropriate point that one of the things that many analysts don't think about is how tempting it is for you to try to build something rather than buy off-the-shelf software. And then how in-house IT teams often get completely bewildered and confused when they hit a wall, that their homemade solutions suddenly aren't linearly scalable or just don't do what they want to do, and maybe they should have brought an off-the-shelf solution for them. So what does that mean in terms of, as an investor? Does it change the way that you're looking at like early stage versus late stage investments? Does it change the way that you're evaluating the portfolio, whether you're investing in the US versus Europe? I mean, how are investors taking this idea of there being a hype cycle and changing the way that they're moving their money around in order to correspond with the different risks and different rewards?
Yeah, no, I think on the kind of early stage, call it venture capital side of things, they're just looking for ultimately the best teams, right? I think, the technology area is important to a certain degree, but it's more, do they believe the team can grow into, 1,000+ employee company, and do they have the ability to do that? And, do they have the kind of, the kind of stomach to be able to achieve that? I think when you get later in the stage in terms of investing, so on the growth equity stage and the private equity, we're doing full buyout and taking control of these companies. It's slightly different. Your risk profile is lower, because you're not investing in 20 companies and one or two of them are going to pop. You're investing in 10, and like one or two are going to be successful, but they essentially, the later you get, all of them have to be successful to a certain degree. So it's a different way of looking at the hype cycle, and there it's more these established businesses. Do they think there is operational improvements, especially in the later stage? Do they think that they can make operational improvements, help them with go to market, get the right advisors in that are going to help them build their companies, whether or not that's switching out the CEO after a couple of years, which you see very often, and finding and professionalizing these businesses from like a revenue operation perspective, from a delivery perspective. So they have that playbook. So a lot of these tech specialist investors, they work with a pretty sizable internal operations team that are former CROs, CTOs, CIOs, CFOs, and they can then leverage all of that knowledge to kind of insert that into the companies that they invest in. But again, I think a lot of the VC investors are, they're less involved, whereas the later you get and the more control investors get in the company, especially on the buyout and private equity side of things, there's a lot of there's risk, but there's less risk at the same time, if that makes sense. It's like, they're investing later stage. These businesses have, at least 20, 30 million of revenue. They want to get them to that next phase. And then the question is, do they have the market, first of all, the total addressable market, to be able to get them there? And do they think that the management team and that them as an investment partner can help them grow the business successfully?
I want to try to draw some thoughts together and kind of look at like, where are we now and what can we learn. But before then, I see there's another question from Neil, which we're definitely not going to address in later on, which is why are there no competitors to the Gartner hype cycle? I mean, obviously, the Gartner hype cycle is everywhere. I'm not sure if Gartner makes a lot of money from it. Is it? Would it be an easy thing for another analyst firm to duplicate? Would there be any point trying to do that?
Well, as far as I'm aware, the likes of Forrester and IDC next to the comparison to Gartner's Magic Quadrants or waves or of Forrester and the MarketScape from IDC, there are some innovation reports that the Forrester or the IDC company has that at least I'm aware of, where they are discussing the technology, but what I think it was Jackie Fan from Gardner in the 70s or something like that, that patented, and came up with that roller coaster. As we discussed, yeah, nobody found something better until now. But definitely, I think that these analyst firms are also talking about innovation that has been going on, but they just don't see the hype cycle specifically like Gartner does. But I think you can get some competitive um, information there.
Yeah, no, and maybe it's a similar type of story to kind of Google, right? Why is Google the kind of dominant search engine out there? At some point, they just build that, that position, and I think Gartner has done that in the kind of research space. That said, I mean, if you think about what these models are able to do now, especially now with OpenAI with deep research, I was listening to an interview by a Silicon Valley investor, and essentially what they would take them to kind of get up to speed. Let's say on the AI Act, right? You want to say, okay, what are the main implications for the AI Act, and what could be the potential impacts? Just like with GDPR, it trickled down to Brazil, went to California, et cetera. Something like that, you would ask an analyst or somebody in the firm to research for 3 or 4 weeks. Now you can do it in a question of minutes. It was similar to when I was preparing for the AR panel, and I used Gen AI to create this AR hype cycle with, infused with the investment stages that were needed. That also took, let's say a matter of minutes. So what will be the role? I think this is an interesting question about analyst firms in general. If a lot of this research gets, I mean, is it essentially open source? How did OpenAI have access to the hype cycle? Because a lot of that stuff is in the public domain, and it's been trained on that. So I think I think a lot of research firms and consulting firms, for that matter, are starting to ask themselves, like, okay, how can we use this type of technology to enhance the advice that we're giving to end users, vendors, whoever they're advising? And is there an existential threat as these models become smarter and smarter? And I remember what we used to say within the kind of Gartner sales pitch was that you can't kind of currently take all of the experiences that an analyst has had with the kind of supply and demand side of the technology markets and distill that into a specific piece of advice for an end user's query that they have about their, let's say their insurer, and they want to know, okay, what type of AI technology should they be using for this specific use case? Could you use an AI model in the future to give that level of nuanced advice? And I don't think we're currently there, but I think that's an interesting question. Maybe Brian, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Two thoughts there for you. Yes, obviously, the model is changing because making research with that big library that you have sort of available, gives you at least a buddy to make the research. But one thing that analyst firms hopefully put into the mix is, first of all, their own thinking. One, second of all of the conversations that they're having with all of their customers and clients, and learning about all of the problems that they are having and getting a sense of how they need to solve all of that. That's something that nobody can replicate. So a Gartner analyst, and I don't know exactly about Forrester, does something like 600 inquiries on a yearly basis. That gives you so much input that is not publicly available information that gives you more insights, and therefore you can still add value to the conversation. And on the other side, also, if you look at it from from an end user for a company perspective, the big value will start to come in if we are also next to all of the components that have built AI right now. You're going to get business value out of it if you are also using your own business knowledge management systems that you have in place that are not in the public domain and therefore are not providing, general knowledge. Then you are really providing value to your customers and bringing them a better experience, or a quicker process, or more loyalty, or better share of wallet, or whatever it is. That's still at the moment, the missing piece, because AI depends really on three pillars. That's all of that data that you need, all of the algorithms that you need, and all of the computer power that you have. So AI, OpenAI came to the market basically because we cracked in algorithms, um, making all and all of the and having that data set finally available to you, so that the public, you and I, really got our hands on it, and nowadays. And the missing piece right now is getting that business value also from organizational data that is out there, transactional data that they can use to their benefit to engage with customers in that respect. So I think that those are two elements that will never get out of the equation. And still, for analysts to provide value, and also for organizations to provide value, but because they have an additional pillar that is not available to the general public.
And can I try to ask you both then about like lessons learned? I mean, in a way, what you were saying there, it made me think, like, actually maybe a lot of what we learned with conversational AI 10 years ago, frankly, a lot of what we learned with expert systems in the 1990s, maybe a lot of the things that we learned are still true today. It's just that computing power is cheaper, storage is so, and paradigmatically other opportunities open up. But is there something that's truly different about this
No,
wave of AI, or are we very well equipped by the learnings from previous cycles?
Duncan, we talked about AI already in 1952, and within the US Army. And we all knew it was about data, compute, and algorithms that we needed. And just over the last 50, 60 years, we saw all of that progressing tremendously. I remember IBM Watson, having great models, but big problems with all of the data that they needed to ingest for an AI capability to learn. And everybody knew that as soon as we were able to crack, that data set limitation that was out there, which was cracked by OpenAI, and all of the companies that were also working on it, but OpenAI was just the first one, we would have something that is really useful also for the general public in our daily activities of my children on university in making their papers, and to transcripting conversations like we're having right now. We knew that as soon as we had a big data set available to us, it will become easier. And that's what's happening right now. So it's very useful already, and there's fantastic use cases out there. But I think that and by adding the company data and the knowledge management capabilities to it right now, and that's why there's a lot of emphasis at the moment on knowledge management and knowledge management vendors out there again, because that will be the ultimate a mix of having public data and having company data, and bring out value from that.
I want both of you to kind of summarize with three quick thoughts. A quick piece of advice, the biggest risk that people should watch out for. Oliver, I'm going to ask you to go first, and the most promising opportunity. Can I ask you to give us your key takeaways?
Yeah, I think you have to be optimistically realistic on the way that you look at technology. You have to, I would definitely say you have to be open to learning, new things. I think we all work in the technology world, so that's definitely part of it. But having a certain level of kind of British cynicism is also healthy to a certain degree, but that shouldn't stifle, innovation. I would say, with the biggest risk is that if you wait too long and you don't decide to invest in these types of technologies and think, you're safe and you're good, a la Nokia, you can see what happens in those types of situations. So you need to find and figure out who you are as an enterprise, essentially, or as an organization, and saying, okay, what level of appetite for risk do I have, and on the basis of that, make the appropriate investments into the future. And sometimes I think you should invest in things that don't have a very certain benefit or outcome, because that's how innovation essentially happens in these types of uncontrolled environments where you're testing out new things. And yeah, no, I mean, hype is something that has a negative connotation, but I think from an investment perspective, if there was no hype, there would never be new markets, there would never be innovation. These new types of business models would never occur. So yeah, I think all in all, I'm quite biased in that sense. I will also, advise an AI company, so we're trying to figure out what is the right balance between, realism and just kind of moonshots. But I think at the end of the day, use your common sense, and at some point, these types of investments will pay off. And if they don't, try again, I think, is my closing thought.
Thank you. And Brian?
Good. Yeah. Looking at from the investment side, I think I see, AI is not a plug and play solution. Success really requires strategic integration. So I'm hoping that businesses, will focus on real world use cases that are out there, have data readiness as an organization, and puts change management in place, and not just for the deployment models. And I'm also hoping that AI, will be aligned with their business goals, and not just adopted for the sake of innovation, that is out there. And I say that because I've spoken about AI winters, and I don't want to get into an AI winter again. I think that the genie is out of the box at the moment, and it will never go in again. But let's not get into don't make the trough too big, in order to get into another winter again. And that's where the biggest risk straight away is coming from. Vendors should try not to overpromise AI capabilities that leads to failed expectations and really wasted investments, from organizations, because I've seen it a couple of times, and now, in the past, and the recent one with the chats, with the chatbots, before the pandemic, that were not helping. And I think the most promising opportunity, because AI is fantastic out there, it's an intelligence amplifier as far as I'm concerned, really enhancing human decision making, and not really replacing it. So use it as your intelligence amplifier, I think, is for me, the opportunity is out there for organizations.
Perfect. Well, Brian, Oliver, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to have the recording up on YouTube sometime tomorrow, I guess, for the people who registered but couldn't make it. But this was an amazing discussion. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, and one
Thank you so
one
much,
final
everyone.
thought from me is, are you sure this wasn't AI generated? Only time will tell.
This year, definitely no AI, but in 6 months' time, you never know. Anything could be different. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you
exactly.
so much. Speak
Thank
to
you
you
so
again.
Thank you.
much, and have a good
Thanks.
evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.